Hey guys, it's Marion here from Movement Solutions. I'm a physio who has a bit of a special interest in feet, and that developed because I realised what they do for us. Before I realised what they did for us, I probably wasn't that interested in them. But the more I learned and read, the more I realised that every time we take a footstep, we have opportunities we are either capitalising on or missing out on. So I am here to answer three questions that have been put to me. And the first one is why I am an advocate of barefoot shoes. Um, I'm actually an advocate of barefoot motion, but I am also practical and aware that sometimes we don't have that option. But basically, I'll speak firstly about why getting your feet out of a rigid shoe is a good idea. Number one, our feet are sensory organs, meaning they send more information to our brain about where we are in space than our eyes and ears combined. So when you put a foot in a rigid, hard, thick-soled shoe, you are depriving it of sending information to the brain, and it makes it hard for the brain to figure out what surface it's on, how level that surface is, and then what compensations it should be making higher up the chain to adapt for that. So sensory organization is important, and the foot is a big driver of that, particularly in kids as their brain is developing. The sensory input from the shoe is a huge driver of what allows their cerebellum to organize itself, which helps a child's brain process information in a much more quality way. So barefoot motion is actually predominantly really a lot more important for kids as they develop, um, and our elderly population who are experiencing a diminishing of their eye sensory input and the ear sensory input. And so I like to think that if we can boost the sensory input from their foot, then at least we're preserving as much of that information for the brain as possible, so that that person and that body can balance as well as they can for as long as they can. So sensory is my biggest number one reason for the sole of our feet being able to do what it was designed to do, and that's contact directly with different textures, different thermal levels, so hot, cold, rough, smooth, uneven, even. The more variety of foot encounters, the more alive the sensory system becomes or stays. Number two reason is if we look at a foot, it has 33 joints, 26 bones, 33 joints. Now that's a hell of a lot of movement possibility in a small part of our body. The very fact it has so many joints tells us it was designed for movement. And so when we go and put a shoe on it that holds it still and shuts down that movement, we're messing with nature. We're messing with how we were designed. The ripple effect, when you don't have all these 33 joints moving, some joints move too much, which creates pain, but also joints higher up the chain have to compensate for what's not happening in the foot. So you may not even feel pain in your foot, but you'll feel it maybe in your knee or your hip, or even up higher in the spine, purely because of what the foot's unable to do, because it's been caged in a shoe for most of its life. When joints aren't allowed to move, the muscles and the soft tissues around them do not get the stimulation they require to become strong and resilient. So we end up with a foot that is either really low tone because it's had no muscular stimulation because the joints haven't moved, or we have a foot that's very joint rigid, meaning those joints have decided to lock and fuse together because no one's asked them to move in a long time, and they've reasoned quite logically that, oh well, we're not being asked to move, so we shall just close ourselves down and shut down for the day. And as I said, when that happens, then we are chasing compensations the whole way up through the body for the rest of that person's life. So there are three reasons, really, why I'm a big advocate for barefoot motion: sensory, motor, and muscle. Second question I'm going to answer, which is, doesn't my foot need cushioning and support? It's a really good question, actually. If you from a child were given the opportunity to move barefoot, as actually most of my generation were, then our feet have adapted to that and they don't need cushioning and they don't need support. But if a foot has been given that environment and it has become used to being supported and cushioned, then when you ask that to transition to a less supportive and less cushioned environment, we can anticipate, of course, it's going to struggle. So what's nice is to know where this foot's starting, what's been its background, and how do we encourage it to move from high support, high cushion to lower support, lower cushion. That may be a process that takes 2 years. It's not a process that you begin if something in your foot's hurting. Sometimes when we have a painful part of our foot, it needs cushioning and it needs support to reduce the pain in that segment. It's a bit like if we break our arm, we put plaster on it while the bone heals, and then once that bone's healed, we get the plaster off and we start moving it again. Now, the problem with too much cushioning and support in our feet is that we tend to put these supports in and leave them in. And long after the pain has settled down, they're still in there and they're not required. So, no, we don't need cushioning and we don't need support if the foot is fully able and fully functional and has a history of coping with the stresses we put through it. But you have to remember where you're starting from and where you want to end up. The rate of progression is very individual, and I basically encourage people to start simply with 5 minutes of walking on soft green grass every day. That's a simple, flatline way to introduce your feet to more sensory stimulation, more movement, and therefore more strength. At the top of that scale, you have ultra distance runners who are running in barefoot shoes hundreds of kilometers and coping really well because they've got the motion in the toes, they've got the motion in the rest of the joints in the foot, and they've trained a thing called fascial recoil, which is the ability of the springs and the soft tissues in the foot to absorb impact. So we've got these different different levels of foot function, and you never want to take someone from low function and say do this, and likewise you never want to take someone at high function and shove a support in that they don't need. So it's a great question, and the answer is a little bit tricky, and as always with feet, it comes back to usually there's no blanket rule, and the attention that foot deserves is based on the uniqueness of what's presenting. So I hope that one helps. Third question, are barefoot shoes just for people with wide feet? Again, no. Anyone can have a barefoot minimalist shoe if they transition into it slowly and steadily and they're mindful of the signals that their feet are giving to them in any moment. I have a very wide foot and I hate narrow, rigid shoes. My feet will scream at me. In the barefoot minimalist shoe world, there's such variety these days. You can have shoes where the toes are separate. You can have shoes where the toes are still in a toe box, but it's not a rigid toe box. There's variety. So speak to someone in the barefoot world who actually can advise you on what the best barefoot shoe is for your foot. And there's even transition phases with those shoes. So you don't need to go from high cushion, high control to absolute barefoot minimalist. There's these whole spectrum of shoes in between that'll help you transition nicely over many years. But I would say it is a worthy mission for your movement system, for your balance system as you age. The more we can get our feet fit, the better it helps our movement system, particularly for the longevity of the body that the feet are attached to. So I hope that helps. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out and let me know.